Yeah, it says the content has been sent to the third party.
52 are here.
The YouTube is working?
Yes, it will just take 1 minute.
Yeah, it will take a little bit. Yeah, I agree.
It takes a little time. It's saying upcoming now.
Yeah, it's live now.
Yes, it's live. on
Yeah,
YouTube.
Adarsh, ready?
Okay. Chinmay,
Ready.
Chinmay, we will
Yes.
we can start the recording also, and then Alika takes over.
Yeah, it's live now. Yes, it's live.
Okay, starting recording.
Good evening, everyone. We would like to welcome everyone here for the first in the KCPC BMU talk series. Today's is by Deepti Sachdev, and I will pass on to Katha for her to introduce KCPC, and then we'll come to BMU and the affiliation between the two organizations. So Katha.
Thank you, Alika. And thank you very much, everybody, for your presence today. Before saying a few words about the Kakar Center of Psychoanalysis and Culture, I would like to thank our partners at Munjal University, Dr. Arvindam Banerjee and Professor Shyam Menon, and especially Professor Anup Dar and Professor Ashok Nagpal for organizing this first series of lectures in collaboration with KCPC. Without Professor Anup Dar's relentless engagement, this series of lectures would not have happened. And not to forget, our first speaker today, Dr. Deepti Sachdev, who knew Sudhir for many years, taking supervision from him in her clinical practice and her teaching. Thank you all very much, especially Munjal University. Now to KCPC, which stands for Kakar Center for Psychoanalysis and Culture. The idea of the center came up in summer 2023 when I invited a group of Sudhir's former students and trainees to Goa for a private seminar with Sudhir at our house. Professor Ashok Nagpal had suggested years earlier to create a center, but at that time, Sudhir rejected the idea. He was, as many of you know, not a friend of or great believer in institutions. However, as his end was coming closer, he was open to the idea of forming an institution, not only for his legacy, but beyond. So it was again Ashok Nagpal who suggested to form the center. When Sudhir passed away 7 months ago, we had nothing but a basic idea in head. But it took us less than a month to register a Section 8 company, which is a non-profit entity functioning similar like a trust. Everyone has to put themselves on mute, please. And the setup and work began with many helping and loving hands, not to forget our first generous private donors who choose to be anonymous. To first summarize in a few sentences the structure of KCPC. Imagine it like a soft, open body. Everyone interested to contribute or to be part of can plug into KCPC. KCPC is open to affiliations with institutions, as we have it already with our partner, the Munjal University. KCPC will organize events and collaborate with diverse people, which can be lecture series, reading groups, seminars, conferences, talks, workshops, publications, and not to forget research projects and clinical work. Professionals in the field of psychoanalysis, psychology, and psychotherapy are as much invited as are students and individuals from social sciences and other professional fields, writing or doing research in the field of psychoanalysis and the impact of culture in India and beyond, or coming up with a specific project that fits into the spirit of KCPC. One can plug in with KCPC as an individual or as a cluster, as an institution, or with a hands-on clinical project. There will be many opportunities in the future. To hold the different projects together or inform about the approach and diversity of KCPC's future programs, we will start a quarterly newsletter at some point in 2025, all online, which informs about the activities. You're welcome to be on the mailing list, just pass on your details. Now let me conclude to talk a bit about the content. What does KCPC stand for? Professor Hani Oberoi said about Sudhir in her recently published paper, Sudhir Kakka, Dancing to the Rhythm of Empathy and Imagination, that, and I quote, of central interest to him was the promise of enlivenment that Eros and sexual desire offered on the one hand, and on the other hand, that of inner stillness and quietude, which a spiritual inclination could potentially awaken. And a little later in the same text, along with empathy, Kakka stressed the creative uses of imagination. As he grew older, he started to muse about spirituality as a connective consciousness that expressed itself in the minor epiphanies of life, moments in which we come alive with a constitutive consciousness connecting humans to humans, humans to non-humans, nature, plants, animals, insects, and so on, end quote. I'm quoting the above to stress on the importance of culture in the shaping of an Indian approach to psychoanalysis in comparison to the West, whose cultural imagination, as subjective as the Indian experience, has been confused as being a universal psychoanalysis truth for too long. This is one of the core themes regarding research and work within KCPC, the impact of culture within psychoanalytic work or related work. To say it differently, and I quote from a joint text several of us wrote for KCPC, the mental representations of culture, our cultural imagination, has been a relatively unexplored territory in psychoanalytic discourse. Disseminated through myth and legends, proverbs and metaphors, songs and iconic artworks, the stories a culture's members tell each other are enacted in rituals, conveyed through tales to children, given a modern veneer in movies. Cultural imagination is equally glimpsed in admonitions of parents in the future vistas they hold out to their children, indeed even in the way its children are touched and fed and carried about. For more than a century, the cultural imagination of psychoanalysis has been assumed and largely continues to be assumed as being Western. Although the cultures of psychoanalysis in South America, France, Italy, England, United States, and so on, do have distinct and important differences, they all share a strong family resemblance with their common origins in the Hellenistic Judo-Christian cultures in which psychoanalysis too has its roots. These origins distinguishes them clearly from the cultural imaginations of Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Iranian, and other non-Western civilizations. The rise of the multicultural movement in many Western societies has resulted in more and more calls from analysts of varying persuasions to re-examine the issue of culture in psychoanalysis. Yet, it is the cultures of race and class, rather than that of a society or a civilization, that continue to draw most psychoanalytic attention. The focus on race and class, rather than society and civilization, of course, reflects the dominant social Western concerns of Western societies. Perhaps this can also be tracked back to the ignorance of most Western analytic theorists of the cultural imaginations of non-Western civilizations. Of course, we are aware that no individual is a caricature of his or her culture. A person is greatly modifiable, but not infinitely so. His or her mental life is the end product of a complex interaction between the person's culture, family milieu, and his or her own needs and desire-based fantasies, each enriching, constraining, and shaping the others as they jointly evolve through the life cycle. None of these constituting inner worlds, mental representations of the body, family, and culture, are primary or deeper. All of them flow into the same river we call psyche. Building on the works of Indian psychoanalyst and cultural theorist Sudhir Kakar, the center shall work towards the creation of a global psychoanalysis instead of merely local, national, or Indian psychoanalysis. It will draw resources from multiple civilizational roots and manifold theories of the human psyche, thus modifying the current psychoanalytic understanding of fundamental questions of human existence, the human mind, and the quest for psychic truth. As the globalization picks up pace, we must realize how different civilizations and their cultural imaginations are an invaluable resource for the reinvigoration of psychoanalysis, psychotherapy, and other disciplines connected to the promotion of mental health. So, if you're getting excited, connect with us. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm giving back to Alika.
Thank you, Katha. That was Katha, Dr. Katarina Kakar, she's the director of Kakar Center for Psychoanalysis and Culture.
So are you, Alika.
Thank you. And thank you for outlining the global vision and purpose of KCPC and creating such a warm reception for the cultural and psychoanalytic researchers, thinkers, for them to come and affiliate themselves with us. And our first affiliation, thank you, Katha. And our first affiliation, which has been with BMU, which was done when Professor Kakar was still alive, and conversations happened between him and Professor Shyam Menon, who's the Vice Chancellor of BML Munjal University. Over to you, Professor Menon, to tell us a little bit about that journey and more. Yeah.
Thank you, Alika. I really don't want to come in the way of those of all of us who are waiting to listen to Deepthi, and I'll quickly come to the point. The BML Munjal University has been around for about 10 years, and then we have had the initial focus on disciplines like and programs like engineering, management, and recently law. the School of Liberal Studies found its inception only last year. And early this year, we sought to get Professor Kaka to do our inaugural lecture. So in that connection, we have been in touch with him, and then in that connection, I had a conversation with him on online, in which some of the ideas, which is now getting fructified, came up. It is so the KCPC as an idea was germinating at that point in time, and the School of Liberal Studies, which we had established at BMU, we were very particular that psychology, psychoanalysis, and culture and psyche, all these will have to be equally focused on, along with history and economics and so on and so forth. So this is something which we were very particular. And it was so fortuitous in that sense that Professor Kakkar mentioned about the center, and then this led to a conversation, and and this collaboration between KCPC and BMU happened. We were unlucky in the sense we couldn't get Professor Kakkar to do the inaugural lecture. But we feel that the KCPC, our association with KCPC is going to, in some sense, be a fruition of what would have become a continuing association with Professor Kakkar himself. The series of lectures which KCPC and in collaboration with BMU are planning is on psychoanalysis and culture again, and it is basically meant to give a platform to scholarly work and practice-based insights in this area. And I'm so privileged that I've been asked to speak on this day, and particularly when the speaker and the discussants, all three of them, I have had the good fortune of working with. I keenly look forward to listening to Deepthi and the discussants as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Menon. Over to you, Arindam. Arindam is the Dean of School of Liberal Studies. If you could introduce the affiliation a little more, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Alika. And I would first like to thank both Anup Dhar and Ashok Nagpal for their persistent efforts to bring us to this point where we have this happy occasion of launching this talk series as part of the collaboration between BMU and KCPC, and again having somebody like Deepthi kind of inaugurating it. So thank you, Deepthi, as well. I won't take long because I understand that we are all eager to listen to Deepthi. But very briefly, the School of Liberal Studies, when it was launched last year with a flagship program of an undergraduate 4-year program in liberal arts, when a few of us who were the founding faculty at the school got together and started ideating about how does liberal studies really look like, we did realize that there is a need for contextualizing liberal studies in the local context, in our context of local communities. And therefore, when we started thinking about the content of such a program, we started off by looking at, of course, the most important human, social, and ecological questions. And while doing that, we strongly felt that it is not just enough to look at the material aspects of those questions, the material contradictions, but also invest our time, our energy, and our mind in also trying to understand the workings of the human mind and its relation with the material realities and the complex relationships. Psychoanalysis, psychology, psychoanalysis and culture itself is a in-house strength that we already have. And with Anup and Professor Ashok Nagpal kind of being associated with us, it has got a fillip. And this is where we are. So Along with this, we have also kind of strongly felt about developing a pedagogy that is aligned with some of these investigations, not simply a didactic pedagogy within the classroom, but can we actually also immerse ourselves in the field, immerse ourselves within both humans and nature, and understand, investigate, acquire knowledge through relationships, through that immersive pedagogy. And our students, of course, undergo a immersion module right from the beginning, something that's rare in undergraduate programs. And it's not been an easy task. We have had to be cautious and careful how we do it, but we are in the happy situation of it, kind of taking some shape, and also students kind of experiencing a more transformative journey. There's a long way ahead, and we have only begun the journey, but transformative praxis is also therefore a core component of the philosophy with which the School of Liberal Studies is developing. And with that, I'll leave you and, look forward to this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Arindam. Transformative praxis is a good word also to describe what we are set for this evening. Before I pass on to Deepti, a quick announcement. So the KCPC BMU talk series, we have 5 of them in this semester. Other than Deepti, Feb onwards, there is Ashish, Shifa, Shalini, and Anshumita. So these are the 4, and then in the next semester after that, so probably August onwards, we will be starting with Neetu and a few others. As it is getting curated, the announcements will be made. So over to you, Deepti, the sugar and salt of human touch.
Thank you, Alika. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm very happy to be here. And where I am right now, I wasn't sure about the timing of this talk, as you know, Alika, because I'm right now in the south of Mexico, and it's about 7:30 a.m. here. But as I'm listening to everyone and, just imagining myself in the company of friends, I think it's perfect because it's such a marvel that we are joining from so many different places. And I think it's a real tribute to Sudhir Das' imagination of a really global psychoanalysis. So perhaps this is the way we could have begun and no other way. Thank you to all my dear friends, my mentors, to KCPC, BMU for giving me this platform, to Professor Ashok Nagpal, Professor Anup Dhar, Alika, Katha, Amrita, and of course, my colleagues and students at School of Human Studies, Ambedkar University, which is the place where a lot of conversations and discussions around what I'm presenting today actually took genesis. So without more ado, let me just start. And I'm just, about the structure of the talk, what I will be doing is that it's a longish time span that we have, so I'll do it in 2 parts. I'll present the first part of my talk, in which I look at what the absence of materiality of touch in the context of caste constitutes. And then we can have a quick discussion. And then after that, I come back and present the second part of my talk, which is based on psychological untouchability. So I hope that's all right. About the title of my talk, The Sugar and Salt of Human Touch. it's something that I've borrowed from my very dear friend and a beloved poet, Ananya Das Gupta. And I just want to quickly recite this poem because in this moment, and I think in many moments, it almost feels like a prayer. So I'm remembering Sudhirda and also Professor Menon. And here's how it goes. I may lose the taste for sugar, for salt. I may lose the taste for most of much. What I hope keep in its lack is the sugar and salt of human touch. So I thought that that's how I'll start. Trying to, all right. So what I'm presenting today is part of the wider doctoral work that I did, exploring our experiences and practices of touching and non-touching, and how these are situated in our social and intimate relationships. Touch as a concept was conceptualized at the interface of Eros or intimacy on the one hand and care and well-being on the other, paying special attention to the phenomenon of untouchability linked to caste in the Indian context. Embedded in the psychosocial tradition, the work draws widely from psychoanalytic and depth psychology that pays attention to what lies outside our conscious awareness, but is nevertheless real, and the ways in which otherness and processes of othering function socially and psychologically. Over the years, touch has come to be examined in its different facets across several disciplines and fields. For instance, the work on contact comfort in developmental psychology, how babies feel soothed by maternal touch, and how this physical skin-to-skin contact is important, as important, if not more, as the maternal feed. There's also been work on the role of empathy and touch in promoting positive health in medical outcomes. There is the role of social touch in attachment and compliance. And of course, outside scientific investigations, myths, folklore, and indigenous healing traditions in India acknowledge the miraculous powers of cure attributed to the hands and healing touch of certain chosen individuals. In the last few years, the interest in the study of touch has also become amplified given the global context of the coronavirus pandemic, as well as exploring new fields of artificial intelligence and digitization of touch. Given the far-reaching significance of human touch in our lives, it comes as no surprise that universally, socialization into cultural practices of touching is initiated from a very early age, long before we are conscious of it. This socialization is infused with cultural messages that regulate who or what is to be touched or not touched. This is done by assigning to these exchanges symbolic meanings of safety, intimacy, danger, otherness, purity, pollution, and contamination. So my research work explored how the conduct of our body is punctuated with the presence of these cultural and social regulations, and how these in turn shape our experience of the practices of touch. The psychological experience of touch in a cultural ethos haunted by the discourse and practice of untouchability also needs to engage with the question of caste and with what I came to term as the caste unconscious. What happens when this caste barrier is broken in relational intimacy? This was a question that I was drawn to look at. Can such relational touch offer a promising counterpoint to the anxieties around untouchability that lurk in the Savarna psyche? The central idea behind the touch-caste connection in this work emanated from Sudhir Kakkar's observation in how caste-based othering is transmitted intergenerationally and writes itself into the psyche of the individual outside of their conscious knowledge. Kakkar suggests that in an overtly modern egalitarian order, caste prescriptions are not transmitted explicitly, but operate as a pre-verbal knowledge feeling in our bodies. In a poignant example, he invokes a scene in which a baby held in the arms of a parent subliminally receives the social attitudes of the parent in the very ways in which it is held. On seeing a lower caste person come close, the body of the parent experiences a kind of tension, a kinesthetic tension, which is passed on to the child. All of this happens without any exchange of words. The child has registered their expressions of disgust, unconsciously mimicking them in his own face and body at any threatened contact with an untouchable. Thakkar's observation became a starting point for me to wonder how caste and untouchability may be written into our bodies and into our psyches as adults, still present, albeit below the level of conscious awareness. So in the first part of my talk, I look at untouchability as a failure to actualize our capacity for touch because of injunctions on certain kinds of relations, those that are deemed socially improper or impure. This in turn is linked to the dichotomy that is found in the Hindu culture between the erotic and the ascetic, where the ascetic is often seen as higher, more pious, and more pure, while the erotic is seen as bodily, more base, and often potentially corrupting and dangerous. As a narrative illustration, today I take up the film Samskara, based on the novel of the same name by the author U.R. Ananthamurthy. The novel was published first in Kannada in 1965 and translated into English in 1976 by A.R. Ramanujam. I use the film based on the novel to examine the dichotomized relation between the erotic and the ascetic, both with their own beliefs about the sensual. In many ways, this binary is an abiding theme of Hindu classical literature, living folklore, as well as everyday life. And I picked this story because it's an interesting kind of narrative. Some of you might have seen it. The movie is available on YouTube. And of the story, M. Krishna Swami remarks that it is a story which generated widespread controversy. I quote, It troubled traditionalists that were unable to come to terms with the scathing critique of their community. It troubled leftists for failing to politicize or historicize issues, moderns for the nostalgic return to a pre-modern era, and feminists for painting of women as withered hags and luscious goddesses. Unquote. So because psychoanalysis concerns itself with all things that are disturbing and what this disturbance inaugurates, I thought that this would be an interesting narrative to examine. Samskaras, as many of you would be aware, according to Indian and yogic philosophy, are the thoughts and actions and intents that one has ever experienced, which leave behind mental impressions in the form of psychological imprints. The afterword of the novel suggests that samskaras denote a rite of passage or life cycle ceremony. It also means forming well or making perfect, the realizing of past perceptions, preparation, making ready. The setting of the film is in a South Indian village by the name of Durvasapur. Durvasa in India, in Sanskrit, refers to a dwelling that is difficult to reside in. In Kannada, it means something which helps solve a mystery or a clue. It's also widely believed in Hinduism that Durvasa was an incarnation of Shiva. He was a powerful mystic yogi known for his anger and fearsome curses. In Marathi folklore, he's identified as a saint who was a great eater and a glutton. So the film begins with a crisis that happens in Durvasapur. This crisis has been precipitated by the death of an immoral and unprincipled Brahmin named Narappa. No one is willing to perform his last funeral rites. The reason for this is that when he was still alive, Narappa had turned away from the virtuous life prescribed for a Brahmin. Instead, he had taken openly to drinking, eating meat, living with a lower caste woman, basically all considered to be acts of transgression in the orthodox Brahmin worldview. All of his sensual indulgences had been in marked contrast to the bitterly self-denial and control that was expected of the Brahmin individuals. His status as a renegade who was denounced by others placed his identity as a Brahmin under question, forcing the other Brahmins into a quandary, wondering if he merits a Brahmin funeral, and if so, who should perform these rites. Recounting the multiple wrongs that he had engaged in, now no one wishes to touch his dead and defiled body. Meanwhile, Narapa's mistress, Chandri, who's a Dalit woman and a Devadasi, offers for the purpose of the rite and its expense all of her jewelry, further rousing in these Brahmins conflict. Now there is confusion because as they know that the person who will be performing the ritual will be getting gold, there is a confusion that begins to ensue as to who will perform the ritual. So the same Brahmins who were earlier reluctant are now very eager to come in out of their covetousness for Chandri's gold. Unable to resolve the dilemma, they turn to Praneshacharya, who is the most learned man in the village, widely regarded for his sense of justice and wisdom. He finds himself equally bewildered and suggests consulting the scriptures in order to reach an acceptable solution. However, the scriptures offer him no clear guidance either. In order to find a way out of this conundrum, he undertakes a personal journey, offering arduous prayers to the god. While he's searching for the solution, Narapa's corpse is left untouched in the village, and according to tradition, none of the Brahmins in the village can eat food till the funeral rites have been completed. The whole ethos is one in which uncertainty hangs heavy, and their impatient wait and hunger adds to the anguish of this uncertainty. Praneshacharya's prayers yield no fruit. There is no solution in sight, and he is left feeling utterly lost and dejected. Having gone without sleep or food since the news of the death, weary from the burden of responsibility that has been entrusted on him, and feeling defeated at the hands of the failure that he has met, he walks out of the temple where he has been praying. As he does, he stumbles at the threshold of the temple out into the forest and finds Narapa's mistress, Chandri, waiting for him. What ensues is as follows. In an unexpected, unguarded moment in the dark, in which their compassion for each other's predicament, she forlorn after the demise of her lover, and he despondent at failing in his duties towards the other Brahmins, blend into an erotic caress and ends up with a passionate lovemaking. In the morning, Praneshacharya wakes up to find himself lying in Chandri's lap as she lovingly strokes his hair. As the realization of the previous night's events gradually dawns, he's consumed with shame and regret. Discomposed, he leaves the scene, hiding en route from the passers-by that he encounters, desperately trying to save face, and yet painfully aware of the sinful nature of his actions. At home lies his ailing wife, who he has been ministering with devotion since the time they got married. They are a childless couple, and so far, Praneshacharya's caretaking for her illness has been exemplary and unblemished, one that he performs without complaint. This leaves the wife feeling somewhat oppressed by the weight of gratitude she feels, mixed with the ways in which the assumed nobility of his actions serve to magnify the distance she experiences between him and her own deformed self. On reaching home, as he sees her, Praneshacharya's heart is torn asunder with the knowledge of what he has done. He finds it hard to face her and to face the other Brahmins, who he must inform of his failure to find the solution to the funeral, even as he's hiding from everyone the truth of his own transgression. The Brahmins now, without much choice left, must now go to the senior guru in another village to seek his counsel for the disposal of the dead body. Meanwhile, much to the horror of the villagers, the corpse continues to lie in the village, rotting, attracting villagers and eagles, widely considered to be a bad omen. Alongside, bizarrely, dead rats begin to turn up all around the village. The Brahmins decide that while they are away and while the shadow of these bad omens looms over the village, they must send their wives and kids to live with their parents. As they all depart on their journey, Praneshacharya is left alone in the village, unable to accompany them on account of his ailing wife. Later, that very morning, in what feels like a punishing coincidence, his wife breathes her last. Still reeling under the emotions from his actions in the forest temple the previous night, Praneshacharya is devastated. He cremates his wife, performing all the rites by himself in the absence of others, before setting out, confused and lost, on an unknown journey, aimlessly wandering away from his home and village. This sets the stage for the next part of the narrative, where our straggling lost protagonist encounters Puta, a man of the town who's chirpy, talkative, lovingly annoying, and thick-skinned, and something in direct contrast to the sullen repentance and contrite silence embodied by Praneshacharya. Goaded on by a very persistent and willful Puta who refuses to leave his side, Praneshacharya now finds himself in the middle of a big festival in the town fair. At this festival, he's introduced to experiences that have so far been completely shunned by him in his fabric of austere living. Drinking coffee, watching a cockfight, visiting a prostitute, and eating in a temple with other Brahmins, even though he's still in mourning, he finds himself thrust into each of these acts which are considered to pollute not just the Brahman karta or doer, but if word gets out, these would bring defilement to the entire fair and the entire village where he's present. In these encounters, Praneshacharya finally has his moment of reckoning as he comes to the painful realization that he is no different from the dead Narappa. Narappa had been condemned by all publicly for his habits. In fact, what Narappa had performed in open defiance, Praneshacharya had been doing in hiding and fear under the guise of a false identity. It is clear to him that he must own up to his actions without justification as markers of his true self for which he must assume responsibility. In a final decision in which we see his agency emerge, away from the mechanical compliance to the dictates of traditions or of social pressures, as he owns up authentically to his feelings for Chandri, he decides that he must return to her as she waits for him at his home in the village. Now, this is the broad narrative of the film, and we find that the film stages him, Praneshacharya, as a protagonist who's pure and wise and noble, but also fails in his virtue through his impure love-making with Chandri and then other transgressions that follow, leaving him defiled, shameful, and contrite. There are many ways in which Narappa reflects the internal psychological double of Praneshacharya. In psychoanalytic parlance, we would say the disavowed other of the Brahman. Narapa, the sinful, enjoys all the material pleasures and sensuous indulgences that are considered as defiling the purity of the Brahman. He lives in a world of wine, music, women, and laughter. Politically, he symbolizes the denunciation of the orthodox Brahmanism and its meaningless adherence to empty rituals. In many ways, the two are positioned as antagonists, since Praneshacharya will not touch or incorporate anything that will contaminate his piety. At this moment, I just want to pause here and turn to Sundar Sarukai's deconstructive reading of the phenomenon of untouchability. We find that there is an interesting premise that he offers. Sarukai suggests that untouchability lies at the very heart of Brahmanhood. Several rituals impose temporary periods of non-touching on the Brahman, during which the body's state of purity is especially fragile. However, despite this kind of untouchability being the very core, it is outsourced or philosophically supplemented to the untouchable, such that it acquires a positive virtue in Brahmins and a negative one in Dalits. I'm using the two terms interchangeably, but advisedly, Dalits and untouchables. We will not have to go, we may not have time to go into the technicality of the difference between the two, but I do want to acknowledge the difference. Since it is the Brahman who is unable to touch them, as the touch unable, it is he, the person who refuses to touch, who becomes the real site of untouchability. He refuses to fulfill the potential of touching, and in doing so, denies himself the capacity to touch oneself, since the model of touching, unlike other senses, is such that in touching others, one is also touched. To not fulfill this potential for touching creates very different kinds of psychological consequences for the Brahmin and the Dalit. For the Brahmin, it evokes feelings of repulsion, rejection, power. And for the Dalit, it evokes feelings of humiliation, shame, and smallness. The gesture of touching here, or the practice of touching, conceptualized as such, then is not just a sensory practice, it becomes a significant moral sense. It's also interesting that while the class of Brahmins known as the Acharyas, they are in a state of permanent untouchability, but this untouchability is ideal or deferential and renders them superior to the rest, unlike the permanent untouchability of the Dalits, which renders them as despicable. In the film, a different kind of untouchability attaches to the body of Praneshacharya's wife, Bhagirathi, who is invalid. Here, we find a woman who is reduced to a sexless, lifeless body whose invalidity is instrumental in maintaining the Acharya's piety and nobility. She denotes the reduced or diminished body where there is little scope for pleasure or desire. Serving her tirelessly in her illness makes the husband still more exemplary, and his nobility towards her is instrumental for his path to salvation. Bhagirathi's ill body is also continuous, symbolically, with the starving, suffering body of the famished Brahmins who are waiting and who must fast and abstain from eating till the funeral rites have been discerned and completed. While this negation of the material body is often considered culturally as the path to asceticism and spiritual enlightenment, the film, to my mind, urges us to think of how the failure of the capacity for touch is resulting in a kind of asceticism that is soulless, a striving towards the higher self that is necessarily incomplete because of its unintegration with the erotic. This is actually a thesis that Sudhir Kakkar has also developed more fully in his recent writings. The erotic has a fullness and embodied fecundity that threatens the ascetic discipline with its force, to which the latter responds by intensifying its libidinal investment in the idea of dharma or duty, that which is morally obligatory. We find here how the force of tapasya, its tapas or heat, is met with the counteractive force of eros, or life born out of water, to quieten and hydrate that fire. When the wish for moral purity overtakes the consonant possibilities of fusion with the erotic, it is because of an over-rigid and punitive superego that cannot bear moral ambiguity. In the film, Narapa embodies this moral ambiguity and the dilemmas that it ushers in for everyone. But I found it interesting to focus on the person of Chandri, because it is in the person of Chandri that this ambiguity can be transformed into a generative movement forth. Her sexuality heralds something new and unknown in this setting. Pranishacharya has so far lived the life of a celibate, as he spends his days reading from the scriptures and tending to his sick wife with an attitude of Nishkam Dharma. This is a life in which obedience and adherence to rules is what is valued above everything else. In the moment of the sexual encounter, one in which he experiences almost in a state of consciousness that resembles a state of intoxication, he discovers with Chandri the pleasures of intimacy that he has long denied himself. Psychoanalytically speaking, one can note how the very life of sensuous delights that he is contemptuous and phobic about has also been one that he has wished for, as it haunts him in his dreams. We also find that he would enjoy reading erotic Puranic tales to his disciples, feeding their erotic imagination, even as his own life remains barren under the vigil of an exacting superego. In him, up till now, we see the phobia of desire that thwarts the possibility of immersing into life more fully and partaking of it in all its vitality and vicissitude. Chandri, at the threshold of the temple in the forest, stands for the crossroads between the world of sacred and profane. Interestingly, we also see her undergo a transformation from a mother to a woman in her encounter with Pranishacharya. In her earlier relationship with Narapa, she was little other than a benevolent maternal figure to an enfant terrible. After his death, released from her devotion to him, she finds herself irresistibly drawn to Pranishacharya. It is through Chandri's eyes that we are introduced as audience to Pranishacharya's body as he bathes. I'm just wondering, Chinmay, is it possible for us to show a brief clip of the film at this point?
Yeah, let's do that.
Yes, very much. We'll give you share option and you play. Right, Chinmay?
It's just a couple of minutes, but I thought that
you have to allow her, Chinmay.
Yes, I have.
Go ahead.
And also, I think, Dipti, you have to share the sound of your computer. Yeah, that's one.
Yeah, all right, 1 second.
I was looking at that show clip at 36.19 and I thought, will you do that in your write-up? Yeah.
it's a new machine for me. I'm still trying to see how do I do this.
You have to click on the
No.
share option and
Yes, after share, it's giving me. I want to go to the tab in which I've opened this, but
maybe you can share your entire screen, and on the right hand
Share
side there
your
is an
entire
option called share sound. You can share your entire screen. That's not a problem.
if I share my entire screen,
Use that option, share entire screen.
let's see how this works.
It's coming.
You can see my screen.
Yeah,
It's
you have to
coming.
go to the
How-
video.
It's coming, looks like. Yes. Yes. Play it
And
now.
you can see the film clip.
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
All right.
But did you check
So
on that
we'll-
box, share sound?
It didn't give me any option.
No,
Let's
so-
try.
No, stop share. Stop. No, we are not able to hear. Stop share. And
Share device audio. It's
Yes.
on. Yes.
yeah, you have to, but it says device audio, but it's the audio is
It
only
says
coming.
share device audio, and that's on.
Okay, maybe just share it. Just play the video once
But
more.
we'll try it. If it doesn't work, then I can just read it out, and people can. I'll just try once. Let's see if.
No, let's watch
ನೀವೇನು
it.
ಅಂಜಬೇಡಿ
Is it
ನಾನ್ ಬಹಳ
audible?
ತಂದೆ ತಾಯಿ.
Yes,
Audible.
yes, it is.
ಎಂತ ಬ್ರಾಹ್ಮಣರು ನೀವು, ಅಗ್ರಹಾರದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೆಣ ಕೊಳಿತಾ ಇದೆ, ಏನ್ ಆಚಾರವು ನಿಮ್ದು? ಛೆ ಅಲ್ದೆ ಈ ಇಲಿ ಈ ದುರ್ನಾತ. ಮಾರುತಿ, ನೀನು ಪ್ರಸಾದ ಕೇಳಲಿಕ್ಕೆ ಬಂದಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ಆಗ್ಲಿ ಅಂತಾದ್ರೆ ಬಲಗಡೆಯ ಪ್ರಸಾದ ಕೊಡು, ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ
Okay. Am I back?
Yes, yes, you are. We can
All
hear
right.
you too.
Okay. Okay, great. So I just wanted to, it's not a great print on YouTube, but it's a beautiful scene. And what I wanted to was foreground here is that, in this scene, it is through Chandri's eyes that we are being introduced to Praneshacharya's body, right? The body of the Brahman. And, you see, if you just see this scene carefully, you can almost feel the sensation of the cold water against his skin. We watch this flimsy cotton cloth stick to his waist, his legs. We see him enjoying himself, and we see her enjoying him. Through her eyes, we see erotic passion in the form of wonder, the astonishment provoked by the totally other, and a guiltless, fulsome enjoyment of the body. This is not the first time the viewer has seen Pranishacharya's unmasked, unclothed body. Interestingly, the very first shot of the film opens with him coming out of water. He's bathing, he's offering his prayers. That's how the film opens. And then he walks out of the pond barefoot, plucking flowers for worship. In this first shot of the film, there is a Dalit woman who stands at a distance on one side, deferentially waiting for him to leave so that she can go to the pond. But the second scene, which I just showed you, which comes later in the film, we see a close-up of Chandri's face and her expressions, and as she's watching him. The setting of this river, this pond in the verdant forest, serves as a confluence of the sensuous and the sexual, in which we can see the Brahman experiencing the corporeal and the embodied nature of existence, away from the abstractions of intellect and spirit. We see the prostitute, Chandri, indulging her pleasures in looking, of touching with her eyes, instead of the usual routine of being looked at. This pleasure, this erotic enjoyment is special because, and as Katha was talking about this at the beginning, this erotic enjoyment is special because it is enlivening. Amidst all of the death and illness that surrounds, and you'll see just before the scene, we can see that later in the film, we'll find out that there is a plague that is coming to the village as well. So there is a lot of imagery of death and illness. And amidst all of that, this particular enjoyment is not just partaking of pleasure or of consumption. It is, in fact, life-giving. I would join Emmanuel Levinas, who, having known the horrors of the Holocaust, of life reduced to bare life, asks us to take seriously what it means to enjoy. Levinas sees such enjoyment as epistemic, as both sensation and knowing. The ethical subject in Levinas's vision is the passionate subject. The pursuit of ethics is not to be cleansed of passion, it is shot through with it. Only then do we find the birth of an ethical responsibility that is tied not to a universal law, but to sensibility and its ground. The French psychoanalyst Luce Irigaray, both challenging and developing on Levinas's work, places the fecundity of life in a more proximal and intimate relation in the gesture of the caress. If you watch the film later, you'll see this intimate caress and lovemaking that happens between the two of them. Irigaray links the sense of contact with the lost and forgotten world associated with the maternal. For her, the caress is of a love that is given over to the night, where things have not yet taken their place but remain possible. She writes, and I quote, "Before orality comes to be, touch is already in existence. No nourishment can compensate for the grace or work of touching. Touch makes it possible to wait, to gather strength, so that the other will return to caress and reshape from within and from without a flesh that is given back to itself in the gesture of love. The most subtly necessary guardian of my life is the other's flesh," unquote. So in the scene that I just showed you, you see that the camera actually focuses on Chandri airing the wet pallu of the sari that she's wearing, or her anchal, in the wind. And she notices Pranishacharya at a distance. The image of the open anchal is significant because it represents both a kind of maternal tenderness in the shadow of which the other can be shielded, as well as her femininity, which flows free without the desire to incorporate the other. With Chandri, this sexual and sensual intertwining, this caress in the forest opens up the liminal space of intimacy. Making love on the bed of leaves in the forest is a descent into the earthly pleasures of intimacy and the feeling of being deeply known, accepted, and securely held. In their lovemaking, in the transforming of their flesh, unbeknownst to each other, they both bestow on each other a rebirth. This moment, to my mind, exemplifies what Irigare refers to as ethical passion as wonder. After the failed prayer to Lord Maruti, Pranishacharya stumbles out of the temple feeling forsaken, dispirited, and tired, and he finds himself in the arms of Chandri. The scene shows the passionate workings of Eros entwined inseparably from the tenderness of embrace. Both hungrily explore and devour each other's bodies, and the next morning he lies blissfully asleep in Chandri's lap. V.S. Naipaul reads this incident as an enactment of an infantile fantasy as Praneshacharya wakes up the next morning with his head in the maternal lap. Chandri receives him in an image of the benevolent maternal lover when his own God has forsaken him. The viewer finds in this scene an easy access, typical perhaps of the Hindu psyche, to the fantasy for maternal fusion that is embedded in the erotic embrace with the lover. That this rebirth occurs in the forest is also symbolic for another reason. In the theory of the historical evolution of the untouchables in India that Ambedkar develops, it is suggested that at first all human beings lived in dense forests and hilly habitats. As they settled on the plains, they became divided into caste groupings based on the principle of purity and pollution. With the discovery of agriculture and the production of surplus gains, arose the situation of appropriation by few who could either use brute force to protect themselves or use the force of Brahmanical ideology. The untouchables were pushed out of the village so that they could be used as a buffer zone to protect the village in case of plundering barbarians from the outside. This spatial segregation ensured social and cultural distance between the village and the untouchables, who were allowed to enter the village only at specified periods of time, otherwise confined to remain within the dark hole of their ghettos. The forest, hence, I feel, symbolizes a place that is outside of the codified static world order of the Agrahara. The smell of the wet earth and grass in the forest are allegorically juxtaposed, as Avana also suggests, in an area of naturalness, a place of natural growth of feelings, where Praneshacharya becomes more sensitive to his own needs. Paradoxically, the release of repressed desires in him culminates in the loss of innocence, which leads to the transformation from a child to man and from a mistress to a woman. This forest, different from the forest of Hindu Vanaprastha, which is a teleological destination in which there is austerity, this forest, Kakar would say the Indian jungle, this forest is teeming with life and its rampant and messy wilderness. Their caress, this intercaste caress in the forest, suggests what Irigare would call a fleeting touch that has not yet found a setting. The viewer, in identification with the two, cannot anticipate how this night and the morning will evolve. Neither premeditated nor impulsive, this caress, as Levinas puts it, is a seeking that does not know what it seeks. Praneshacharya says, on waking up from his dreamlike state of communion and realizing that he could have been seen and caught red-handed by others, I have never hidden my face. I'm learning now. At this point, as audience, we do not know what will unfold. Let me quote Levinas a little more fully here. The caress is constituted by the fact that it does not know what it seeks. This not knowing, this fundamental disorder is the essential. It is like a game of something slipping away, a game absolutely without project or plan, not with what can become ours or us, but with something other, always inaccessible, and always still to come. Unquote. Irigaray further suggests that the lovers' faces live not only in the face, but in the whole body. In her inimitable words, the lovers meet in one movement of this incarnation, like sculptors who are going to introduce themselves, entrust themselves to one another for a new delivery into the world, and all the senses share in the nature of the caress, the hand serving in its way as the most intimate means of approach. So it is that as viewers, we will be allowed a tentative intimacy with the embracing couple, not so much through the expressions on their face, but through the camera's focus on where their hands move, expressing, extending, and reincarnating each other. So, unlike the body, the allegorical body that we find in Hindu cosmology, where the Brahman has issued from the mouth of the Purusha and the Dalit from the feet, and unlike the hierarchy we find where intellect and spirit are placed above what is manual, what is corporeal, here we see the play of hands and caress, which is happening not in the touch of mastery, but in a gesture that is affirmative of otherness. Chandri's actions and her corporeality suggest an ease and naturalness. She does not carry the burden of having to be the custodian of community honor or maryada. Shown as the feminine who is not confined to the private or the secret or the silent homeliness of the home, she is public in both her grief as well as her desire, embodying thus in both the radical political love and its possibilities. With that, let me pause and hand it over to Alika and see if we want to take in some questions or invite the discussants.
Yes, thank you, Deepti. I think most of us just got lost in the entire narration. And towards the end, the feeling is that Chandri herself embodies the Indian jungle. We have Professor Ashok Nagpal and Professor Anup Dhar here, and who have been very, very important to this journey that Deepti undertook. They are here as the primary discussants. We would also like to open it to the audience, and anyone has any questions, please ask. Any reflections, any thoughts, any questions, please share. Thank you. Maybe if Ashok, would you like to say something, and then
Chetan has his hand
Chetan
up.
had a point,
oh, okay. Yes, Chetan.
and Vinita ma'am also.
Okay.
Chetan and Vinita ma'am.
Hi, it was a wonderful, I think, session. I really loved it. I'm just sort of I just sort of want to share some thoughts that are coming in my head. They may not be concrete or any wholesome, but I read this book some time back called What is Sex by Alinka Zupančič. A nice one where she was sort of trying to argue that the ascetic sort of ideology in that sense, and you sort of coming from the case of nuns in Christianity, is not simply a sort of barring from enjoyment, but is actually gives you an unlimited access to enjoyment because the sexual act itself is barred in that sense. And if you think about superego as a phenomenon, superego, as much as it is a sort of site of conscience, it's also an injunction to enjoy. And capitalism is actually that space. So I was just thinking with you in that sense that perhaps we would need to sort of articulate enjoyment in the sense of Eros, in the sense of Levinas, as an ethical act, not as a superego act. I think there may be something needs to be said about that at what point enjoyment becomes an ethical act in that sense, and at what point enjoyment only accompanies guilt. I'm not sure how to sort of think this further, but I think something needs to be sort of thought through in very interesting sort of point that you've made. Thank you.
Thank you, Chetan.
Alika, how are we collecting questions together, or how do you want to do this?
So we could do that, Deepti. We have, or if you want to respond to this one, if somebody's raised their hand, at least I can't see it on my screen.
I
Yes,
think Vanita ma'am has.
yes, Vanita.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I just have few comments. I've been reading this psychoanalyst for some time called Annie Reiner. And she differentiates between a very primitive superego, which is central part and parcel of classical Oedipus complex. Freud spoke about superego that we can very well call primitive superego because it's stringent, it doesn't sanction pleasures and so on and so forth. Now, if we kind of talk about adult, mature, sophisticated, evolved superego, which I'm sure has some spiritual components too, we reach a level where the mature superego is a far more nuanced, humane, giving primacy to human experience, giving primacy to true self, as Deepti very beautifully brought out. So my comment is that Indian society, with its ritualistic superego, if I may call it, is stuck at a very primitive, immature superego level when we talk about those rituals. And it has not evolved up to the level of mature social consciousness, integrating that mature superego. So any thoughts about how can we make psychoanalysis a transformative praxis and take the collective superego to that level, which is integrative of true self, which is integrative of being in touch with one's feelings, which is integrative of connection almost at a spiritual level with living beings and even non-living beings. So what are your thoughts? And before I leave you with the question, I must say that in a bid to formulate my scattered thoughts pertaining to this question, I haven't congratulated Deepti as yet. I'm very, very happy to be here. I was feeling very ambivalent about, after a full day and suddenly realizing that it's a talk. But then I decided to be here and I'm very happy and I'm very proud, Deepti. So please go ahead with the response. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Vinita. It's also especially moving for me to see you here, because after I finished with my clinical supervision with Sudhir Kakkar, I've actually been in supervision with Dr. Kshetrapal. So it's really quite an honor to have you present here. And I love both the questions, and I think they're both very, very significant questions. I will just very quickly respond. I think what Dr. Vinita Kshetrapal is sharing is actually something worth reflecting about, in the sense that, is there an Indian superego that is different from the way in which Freud conceptualizes superego? And of course, Freud's superego itself is quite nuanced in the sense that it has the element of a persecutory part and an ego-ideal part. But what I thought Dr. Kshetrapal added quite beautifully and quite poignantly was the idea of spirituality as incorporated in a mature Indian superego, and what that would look like. So I think that's a beautiful thought, and that's perhaps the work that's waiting to happen. I would just say that I think there are minor traditions in India that actually are already doing this. And I know Anup is already exploring that kind of work. So I'll invite him to maybe share a little more in response to this question. The minor traditions that actually are there already in existence, which open up the ascetic and erotic in very, very different sort of ways, where this stultifying binary is not present. Perhaps this binary is more an allusion to the popular mainstream cultural imagination that we have inherited, right? So we think of the two as divorced from each other. But there are minor traditions and that are present within the Indian ethos that I think we need to speak about. And in this respect, I am somewhat of a Gandhian, because I feel that instead of discarding tradition, we perhaps need to reinvent tradition. So I think that I would really invite Anupta to say something, and this other part on which again I think is quite a telling distinction to keep in mind. Enjoyment as consumption, which is what capitalist ideology would like us to think of and do and practice and inhabit, versus the kind of enjoyment that Levinas or Irigaray are speaking of. And the term that she uses is interesting, because she's talking about ethical passion, right? And usually you don't keep these two terms together. In fact, she says ethical passion as wonder. So there is something about wonder and curiosity, and that is being kept together with the way in which passion is experienced and what is to be the ethics and limits of such passion. So I would only add by saying that the moment at which the film stages this, and what I've picked up is that this kind of eros is it is not just an eros of a libidinal pleasure, but it is an eros that also connects to grief and suffering, right? Which is why I said that this particular scene happens, before and after. You will see that there are a lot of images of death, of sorrow, of suffering, and it is, all of these realities and truths of our life, these existential truths that capitalism would have us forget and have us numb. Whereas what we are looking at here, and that's why Chandri becomes so interesting, because both in her grief and in her desire, she's public. She's supple, she exudes that kind of feminine principle. To my mind, that's the way in which one is understanding enjoyment, not as a frivolous consumption, but as a deep immersion into life, one that doesn't become depressive on understanding how much grief and pain there is, and neither does it go into a kind of manic flight, because that grief may be too unbearable, it may be too difficult to go to. So those are just some thoughts that I had. I would like to
Thank
hear
you.
more
Thank
from
you so very
yeah.
much.
But I really want to hear more from both Anup and Ashok on this point.
Deepti, I was wondering if we could take Arjun's question or thought as well, and then we have an open.
Sure.
Yeah.
Am I audible?
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
Arjun.
Yeah, it was a very nice talk, ma'am, and I really enjoyed it. And my questions are actually not questions as such, but they are some doubts that I would like to clarify from you. So when you are perceiving and understanding this dichotomy of erotic and ascetic, I understand. I mean, in the last question from the ma'am, you have clarified much that it's not a very clear-cut boundary as such. There is a perhaps a ambiguity and a blur line. And I was seeing in the sense where the Promesh Acharya became from ascetic became an erotic, and the woman that was engaged, she became ascetic from the erotic. I mean, this exchange of roles that I was thinking that takes place and happens. Have you I mean, you have definitely talked about Promesh becoming and coming down to that lady, but which might show the erotic shade of the character. But I would like to hear some of the ascetic shades of the lady. One question. Another question that I was wondering, that how is it that you are situating the lady herself in the erotic domain, and the protagonist in the ascetic domain? Because I'm thinking from the point of view of the symbolic order, where the Brahmins are being born from the mouth, and in the Freudian polymorphosis perverse state, mouth is considered or said to be the primary source of organ of pleasure. So I feel like the Brahmins are much more driven into the erotic and the eros than the ascetic and the other part. So I want you to comment on this as well. I mean, another small question that I had, that how did the Promesh Acharya got over the guilt that he had after touching first time to the lady? So what happened to that guilt? So these are some small queries that I wanted. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you, Arjun. Deepti, would you like to take it, or should we listen to Anup?
Let's listen to them, maybe.
Okay.
No, Deepti, respond to this.
I can come in. Why don't you go ahead, and I can maybe come in after you.
Just a moment. Housekeeping announcement. For those audience who are watching on YouTube, if you refresh your page, you'll be able to comment and chat there, and you can ask your questions. It's enabled now.
Yeah, no, I don't want to take up too much time. Deepti, actually, this talk by you, and you have only done half of it. You haven't done the full one yet, so we have to give you that time to do the full one. I feel opens up one set of questions that I think Vinita opened, Dr. Shetrapal opened, actually, that does caste make us rethink the fundamental tenets of psychoanalysis? And the superego was one very important point she raised. That is one side of it. The other side of it is the way we have conceptualized psychoanalysis and where you brought the question of the minor traditions, Sahajya being one, actually. Do we then not end up in those divisions that are paradigmatic? Separation, hyper separation between divine and erotic. So these kinds of separations, how do you revisit them? So I think your talk helps us. I don't have a question for you, actually. Your talk helps us see both poles, actually. One is the, as Vinita put it, that is the concept of the superego, the concept of repression, open for rethinking, because we are building the theory or the theoretical framework from a very different archive, or a very different archive of experience. One possibility. So the psychoanalytic heuristic is very different because the archive is very different. So the archive from which Freud builds it and the archive from where, say, Sudhir sir built it, are they different? One possibility is there. Or are there similarities and differences? Possibility two, which is where your minor tradition question comes in. That are there moments which do not see these divisions in simple terms? Are there such traditions also? My last point is actually the way you painstakingly went through the narrative. Actually, you created a narrative out of the narrative, actually. Was for me an experience of the surplus that was hidden in the narrative. Surplus, a surplus that cannot be circumscribed by caste, a surplus that cannot be circumscribed by Eros, a surplus that cannot be circumscribed by standard morality, a surplus that will have to take the relational, ethical, the passionate ethical, the passionate political, the spiritual political into consideration. So the way you presented it, actually, I would not have shared point one and point two. I shared it because of what Vinita beautifully opened up, I thought, and what Sudhir sir has gifted to us, perhaps to my limited understanding. But the third is what came out for me from your narrative, that it was not allowing us any kind of 6-lane highway thinking. It was taking us to the lanes and bylanes of Benares, actually, as if, or the Bhulbhulaiya in Lucknow. It was not allowing us highway thinking. It would only allow us lanes and bylanes, streets and street food, and each lane and bylane will be full of surprise. As you cross a lane in Benares, you hit a surprise, and you hit a mother goddess idol, and then you hit something else in the next bend or the next turn. So the re-narrativizing actually is opening us to a kind of thinking that cannot be highway thinking. It has to be complex, multitudinal, lanes and bylanes. And you cannot solidify, in terms of either caste or sexuality, Eros, or morality. Say, let me restrict myself to these three. So your reading was very, very, very beautiful, not just important in the sense that it was not allowing us a kind of sedimented political, stratified political, or certain secure political. That's all for now.
Can I add something? That this, what Anoop is saying in psychoanalysis in India, if one looks at the beginnings of psychoanalysis and hysteria, and buried is the idea of touch or the lack of touch. This is very much a beginning of an Indian psychoanalysis where a Dalit could, in the social clinic, and the cry of your student brings up the certain questions and concerns about what is the idea of where is the mutability, where does the untouchability lie, and in whom, and those layers. So I thought, the whole work is actually, the paradigm has been taken into an Indian context and built upon. Thank you.
Thanks, Alika. I'm also wondering if Professor Nagpal would like to come in. I'm also eager to hear his thoughts.
Yes, thank you very much, Deepthi. In fact, I won't lose even a moment in praising you because you've had a surplus of that. And I think the churn through which your work has evolved that needs to be remembered and to be given a form. And then within the form, you've managed to evolve a direction with Anoop so poignantly, so significantly, and so acutely that I will just stop here, the praise part of it. It's a complete form. And when you express this openness here that I would like to listen to A, B, C, in which I also figure, it's like revisiting the title of the film, Samskara, which in the rather well-known conference that was held in 1977, in which Erickson said, we, amongst ourselves as conference participants, we decided that Samskara means the right at the right time. The right at the right time. Okay. And since you've infused touch in the lovemaking of these two, I tried to imagine that if Samskara is inviting us to look at what is the rightness of the right at the right time, and then ever since Sudhir has gone away and yet has landed us in the Indian jungle, and there is a lovemaking happening in the Indian jungle, and he's saying, enter the Eros fully as you can open yourselves to, and then within that, surrender. see what is it that will happen. That is where I think he enlarges the clinical to the cosmic. So many an idioms that you pick up in Levinas, in Irigaray, and in others could easily join Erickson's observation, which is that Chandri also is asking through her despair and translates the despair into lovemaking with Pranishcharya. And given those times, we're talking about 77, given those times, that need of Chandri is thought to be a despair full of yearning, longing that Sudhir would have called, to have a child with Pranesh. So if we have, and of course, I'm not saying that that must remain the idiom in a literal sense today. I'm not saying that. And I'm learning here that I must not go on believing that that's the only way to understand. But a child can also be a metaphor and a direction for us in terms of setting up relationship between the younger generation and the older generation. And I'm also 71 plus, so drawing from Erickson is my way of joining him, and sensing your openness to listen to that way of thinking, which I think is a way of saying that perhaps Narappa is one imagination of the greed and the anger, the Durvasapur. Durvasa for his gluttony, for his rage. So Durvasapur is one stage where Pranappa has demonstrated through protest and opened up something. But it can go only that far, and he dies, leaving the baton for the next, which is where Pranishcharya is now joining it. So then the clip that you show, in the clip at my life stage, I see not just the body. I also see this body unifocally pointed in the deep to the rituals which are culminating in the way you show the clip, which is that he comes to Lord Hanuman, sits there, and Chandri is sitting outside with a bunch of bananas in her hand, waiting as if for some encounter, some communication to happen. So for me, it is not just the sensuous sexual, but it is also of the ordaining of the sensuous onto the image of the sacred, and thereby suggesting something that Sudhir evolved in later essays much more sharply and much more evocatively both, to say that the surrender for the guru is something like where the parental imago, that is the father figure, comes closer to the wife and the mother. Okay, so if we look at this sacred not as the patriarchal Brahminical sacred, but as the guru who has sufficient maternal, and within the maternal he forges a direction for action and deeds. So the movements of Pranishcharya, lovemaking, as I felt, is an unfathomable thing, because apparently one description, I haven't seen the film, I'm certainly going to see it, but one description says that both of them are in the throes of despair. He has been disappointed because Hanuman hasn't given him any direction, So end of the evening, he's famished, he's coming out, he's completely frustrated, lost, disoriented, and she is waiting for the verdict. And a very important thing happens here, that these two, in the state of weeping, or at least a latent weeping, move into each other's embrace and go into lovemaking. I think this for me is surrender, sensuous, but also a deep surrender where the contact of the souls happen. So next morning, something that you haven't included, but I was fascinated when I came upon it. Next morning, Chandri feels relieved to to take the body, to hand over the task of cremation of the body to a burial by the Muslim fishermen. So this story also has, since Vinita's question is about a superego which could be spanning a vast scale, not flinching the primitive, but also evolving it step by step. I think the film has a very wide canvas. Two more things I will say, because I'm also aware of the time. I don't know how we're going to manage your second section today. But I hope I'm sort of making enough sense for us to look at this viewpoint of an elder figure, that Pranishcharya and his meeting with Putta or Puta is very much feeding into Erickson's thing about the child, that both of them are creating a child, and so Putta emerges as Put, the child who in his play-like thing introduces Pranishcharya to various feelings. Those various feelings are producing their own churn in him. And I think at some point in the film, we are introduced to a community that Putta belongs to, which is called a Malera community. And Malera community is the community of Brahmins with their lower caste mistresses. So families produced by Brahmins with lower caste mistresses is where Putta has come, or Put, or the child has come. And so in that sense, the end of the film is not conclusive. It is carrying the internal state precisely of what Vinita is looking for, of a man who registers the past, but has also seen the vast stretch of the past into the present. And by the fact that you have picked it up today as a member of a so much younger generation to me, and pick it up in your own doctoral dissertation, suggests the longevity of this work, the longevity suggesting that perhaps its future cannot be bound by a time. In that sense, the special thesis that I've started wondering with Sudhir, that whether Sudhir is only referring to dreaming, or whether Sudhir in the context of the Indian civilization is referring to deeds. So this film and his state is more, I think, an evolution of shifting from dreams to deeds. This is the saga of a deed, of a man touching various stages and beginning to recognize them existing in him, but some of them also receding and others on ascendance. So that's a limited addition that I felt from my life stage as making more sense as to why this film still moves us and has moved you into really globalizing thinking about it when you draw from Levinas, Irigaray, and host of others. And really moving work. And my special congratulations to you with this audience, large number of them. And I think each of these talks, we can see that they have this kernel of something original in them. And that for us is the clinical cosmic that Sudhir was evolving. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashok. And Deepti, I think the responses are showing that there's a timelessness to your thing, but we are at 10 to 9. What we thought was maybe you could do, if you want to do a summarized presentation of your second part, which then we don't have questions, but you just end it with your presentation.
I think Rachna ma'am had a question and she was waiting for quite a while.
Let's take that. Yeah, let's take that.
Yes, Rachna. I can't see. So while Rachna comes back, do you want to start, Deepti? So we'll have about 10
Actually, yeah. Alika, I'm thinking right now when Ashok sir said right way of right things at right time. And I suddenly became aware of the disappointment that I'm going to be engendering in everyone who's also expecting the second half of the talk. And we really will not have time to go into it. And I'm already feeling quite terrible and guilty about it. But then the Hindu part of me remembered that, सब चीजों के लिए उपाय होता है. मतलब जो हमारे prescription भी होते हैं, कुछ गड़बड़ हो रहा था, then you go looking for an upay. So I guess we'll have to find an upay to this. I don't know. Perhaps I should have planned it a little better, that we would have had more time to go into this. I think I just want to.
Anup, would you like to say something about an upay?
Let us go on to 9:15 at least. It's fine, I think. Like we are fine, those of us who are listening to it.
Yeah.
So you'll get at least 25 minutes to do that. And maybe we will write to you if we have our thoughts and questions. Alika, if you're okay with it, because you are the anchor of this discussion, but I'm just trying to find an upay. That's all.
It's good. So all those who can stay.
15 more minutes, all of us perhaps can gift you.
All right. Okay. So, thank you to both of you, Ashok sir and Anupta. I think that I'm also still ruminating over the points that you made, and some of the details that Ashok sir picked up from the film. I think they're answering the questions that Arjun was also asking. I hope some of those questions that, what happens to the guilt, and that the way in which Ashok sir was responding, that how do we make a creative use of our guilt, and what sort of deeds does it take us to? Arjun, your question also on
Did we lose her? There.
No, we
am I audible? Yeah, all right. About the allegorical body of the Purusha, in which the Brahman issues from the mouth, and the mouth is sort of seen as the origin of the word and of a certain kind of omnipotence. And if you place that alongside the way in which Freud talks about the pleasures of orality that emanate from the mouth, I think I would just what I was thinking was that there is a way in which the Hindu personhood is actually talking about the whole body as a kind of mouth. And that's why there are all of these injunctions and an elaborate system that we have around touching and non-touching, and what the sense of contact and skin entails, because it is as if your whole personhood is porous. And through that, therefore, systems have to be put in place, not just around what can go into the mouth or come out of it, but the skin essentially as becoming a kind of all-pervasive mouth, and how touch becomes therefore a central sense for us to investigate from an Indian psychoanalytic point of view. Also, when Anup was talking about, and Alika also, I think I also joined Alika in the image of the hysteric woman that belongs to Freud's practice, and what it's telling us about our contemporary location. Because, there is a way in which the modern life tries to circumscribe sensorial excess. That's how we become civilized. That's how we become sanitized. Whereas I think what the minor traditions are asking us to think of is how do we celebrate these sensorial excesses? How do we bring them into the realm of surprise? What is it about the bodily life that, instead of thinking of it as something to be transcended, when one descends into it, what sort of other sacred becomes open to us? So I'll just pause here. I know, my apologies to others who may have other questions and reflections coming up. I'll go into the second part of my talk, maybe try to abridge it a little bit.
Yes.
Where I'm talking about another kind of untouchability away from the rural, and which is at the site of the university. And, like the hysteric woman in Freud's time was punished by the doctor who, unable to understand her, withdrew his interest, what do we find with the Dalit student in the classroom? And is this a particular kind of psychological untouchability and emotional distancing that is at work? And, since we are all present as educationists, how do we create the university as a psychic space in which thinking for such students can be enabled? So, because I'm using the psychoanalytic lens, I also explore the unconscious anxieties and defenses that circulate among students and teachers, unwittingly promoting forms of caste othering. And essentially, what I'm saying is that as understanding these defenses is crucial for us to deconstruct the resistance to learning that comes from different caste locations. We're well aware that in the vision of modern India, universities have been called as temples of learning. These are temples in which students from all kinds of backgrounds come with all kinds of dreams. And students from backgrounds that are socially disadvantaged, these dreams are especially invested with passionate hopes that attach not just to them, but often to the entire family and those of the entire community. So let me also share here that I grew up in a family in which there were barely any conversations around caste. And only much later that did I understand that this means that my social location in terms of caste has been one of relative privilege. At the same time, my family's history is such that in the lineage of women, I've been the first to have completed college education. And I'm saying all of this because as a first generation college learner, I experience a kind of natural psychological identification with the kinds of struggles faced by students who are also first generation learners, who, despite their diligence and sincerity, find themselves hitting many psychological blocks and emotional breakdowns that often go undetected in their quiet and stoic presentations. We're also living in a time where modern Indian attitudes towards caste are very mixed. Caste segregation is still prevalent, even though caste-based discrimination has been explicitly forbidden by law for over 60 years. So, one thinly disguised form of prejudice that still continues to operate is in the discourse of merit in education. And this is a discourse, again, that we know in which reservation is seen as anti-merit. And this prejudice itself creates a split in which competence, intelligence, and hard work are placed as virtues associated with one caste, and the opposite of these are placed with those of the lower caste. So the outcome of this kind of splitting has been that students who are admitted via reservation policies are often viewed as undeserving or as not sufficiently motivated, as have somehow having manipulated their way in instead of having earned it, right? And I think this is a very, very problematic split. And some of us may be familiar with the works of Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, who challenges the concept of meritocracy in education. I will not go into it, but what I'm trying to say is that, in the space of this kind of education, if you look at the Indian psyche, there is a dual inflection towards education, right? In the modern Indian psyche, on the one hand, education is an instrumental means of acquisition of learning, of certification, of getting a job, of social mobility. On the other hand, it is also infused with the cultural notion of vidya, which is, something that is sacred, that commands respect, and that commands reverence. And it means imbuing the authority of the teacher with a certain kind of idealization. So I want to just briefly talk about a case of that I'm drawing from my experience in the university, that played out in the academic life of a student, Savita, whose name I've changed. And she was a student who was enrolled in a postgraduate psychology course that I was teaching. Extremely outspoken, confident, spirited student, always asking critical questions in the classroom. And she made a considerable impact on all of us as teachers, because she would engage quite energetically in her classes, and often bring to us the question of caste, right? Often she would foreground that in our discussions. This was, however, not always easy, because it was not something that we had really given much thought to. Like, where was caste present in psychology or in psychoanalysis? I'm talking about, 5 or 6 years back. So much as I enjoyed her participation, it also brought up ambivalent feelings for me, because I had gone prepared with certain kinds of lectures, and here was a student pushing me into questions that not only did I not have any answers for, but that I had barely thought about. So, there was Savita exuding a certain forcefulness in her protestations in the classroom, but in examination situations, she would just become crippled with anxiety. She would just become overwhelmed with shame, and often developing physical symptoms like headaches and uneasiness, fever, panic. She would just say, I feel like running away. I was teaching at that time a course on marginality, in which, in the classroom, students from different backgrounds shared and listened to each other's experience, and how this had impacted their educational journeys and its successes and failures. So, it would often become the room would often become quite charged with these stories, and listening to each other in this kind of a containing space was very, very powerful and moving, as we heard stories about life worlds that we had not previously known. So this was in the years that followed the tragic suicide of Rohit Vemula that students had begun to talk more openly about their caste location and what it had meant for them to grow up. Many upper caste students expressed horror, regret, and sadness on learning of the extent of caste-based discrimination that was still prevalent and that their peers had encountered. So there was a lot of political ferment that was happening outside the classroom, and it was also fueling the sense of urgency within the classroom that something must be done. In all of this, Savita was so determined to foreground her positionality and use that to interrogate the normative assumptions in what she was learning across courses, the kind of text that we were picking up, who these texts had been written by, who they had been written for. It was very important for her, and actually there were other students as well. So she becomes a composite for many of those students that I'm carrying in my mind. But like I said, that her struggle with writing was acute. So what she could articulate with her classmates, she found it very difficult to put that in any satisfactory way in her exams. And this was very frustrating for her and for me, because I would feel that, gosh, why are her assignments not reflecting her intellectual potential? And why is it that, often out of her examination situation, she would get judged as shoddy or poor? She would herself get quite upset, and she would become quite defensive. And at the time, what I thought was that this was not necessarily bad, like her upset, because there was some health in it. Even though she would experience failure, she was also defending against that failure and fighting against it instead of internalizing it as some deficiency, which I think some of the other students were doing. Viva situations were especially stressful, right? Even though we had designed them very carefully and in a very facilitative way, the student would get a chance to meet faculty face to face about a written work that they had submitted, and they would receive their questions and feedback. And then this opportunity could be used to elaborate these thoughts further. So, typically there would be a Viva panel that comprised of 3 or 4 faculty members. It would sometimes be open for other students to attend, and there would be an examiner that the student faced. So one time, Savita turned up with a bandage on her wrist, and she told us that she had sprained it the previous night. When her work came up for discussion, she grew increasingly agitated and edgy. She tried to elaborate on the questions that were being asked, but it was all in vain. One examiner, I thought, was particularly hostile and criticized the work in a way that I found degrading. Later, this examiner would say that it was for the benefit of the student and that as a teacher, it was her moral duty to uphold the quality of education and scholarship. Other teachers on the Viva panel who were present were confused, sometimes uninvolved. It looked like there was an altercation that was going to build between the examiner and the student. And in that moment, I found myself feeling increasingly protective towards the student and struggling to contain my own anger. Some of the more sympathetic faculty made some remarks then to soften the situation and encourage the student. But it felt like we were all caught in a kind of crossfire and not able to do anything effective about it. I think perhaps later, as I was thinking about it, that there was some underlying guilt in identifying with the stance of the examiner, who was clearly hostile, but we wondered, there was a kind of wish for peer solidarity, that we teachers have each other's back, or the wish to preserve the autonomy of the role of the teacher, that let her ask the kind of questions that she's asking without interference. However, it disturbed me adequately, and later, as I was reflecting, I thought about the social defenses that were in play beyond the learning dynamics and psychological vulnerability of this student, right? Social defenses actually refer to the way in which a group of people unconsciously collude to protect themselves from anxiety and mental pain, however, jeopardizing the very goal from which people have come together in the first place. This is something that Isabel Menzies Lit has spoken about. She looks at hospitals and the way in which nursing is organized, and how why is it that there is so much dehumanization happens in the context of nursing, which is otherwise considered to be a caretaking profession. So she looks at these kind of social defenses that operate in institutions, and that's the model that I used to think about what was happening with each of us in that moment. And there were memories that I could recall of my own student days, which brought up images of academic struggles and failures that as adults, as faculty, we seldom talk about. At the same time, it's not uncommon, I think, for us to have dreams as adults in which the manifest content goes actually back to our school life, right? So there are dreams of not wearing the correct uniform, or preparing for the wrong exam, missing the school bus. Often these dreams come up when there is a significant transition that is happening in your life, and it gives expression to fears and anxieties around being judged or evaluated or disciplined. So it does tell us something very important about that context and about that stage of our life. And I wondered whether Savita's predicament threatened to bring up some remnants of our own old feelings of loss and shame that had come from the system of competitive academics that we had been exposed to. Perhaps there were also strong undercurrents of unarticulated envy, that somehow the other situation was easier and our own situation had been struggleful, or that, especially that remark about the moral duty to protect the quality of education. I wondered whether some of that unconscious, unarticulated envy may have been in operation as well. I was well aware at the time that as teachers, we were taxed with countless administrative and other chores that were deadening, led to a build-up of resentment and disengagement from emotional investment in relationships that one wanted to have with students. So there was little incentive to put in extra effort for mentorship with such students, which required close academic supervision as well as a holding relationship of care. So often this meant that students from disadvantaged backgrounds ended up evoking psychologically distancing responses. As a result, what was designed to be a learning situation in an education space unwittingly became a space in which the student yet again felt small or embarrassed, enraged, and reinstating the belief that she had failed and was doomed to remain forever trapped in this. And Michael Eigen actually talks about this in the context of unwanted patients. And it was as if these are unwanted students who require very close and painstaking and patient efforts from this institution in order to overcome their historical disadvantage. But as Neil Altman also points out, that part of the historical legacy of trauma, as we've understood in psychoanalysis, is that people end up unwittingly perpetuating their victimization, and people who try to help them may well get drawn into victimizing them in the very act of trying to help them. So this is just a very useful insight to keep in mind. And while it was part of our self-image as psychology teachers that we respond with empathy and care, the emotional experience of being with students who needed such care was also draining. There was a fear of getting too close, since the intractability of problems in the student's life would evoke one's own unbearable feelings of inadequacy. Students would sometimes have the fantasy that the teacher was a therapist, and when there were gaps between what there was the specific need of the individual student and what the general tenor of the policy or regulation of the university would permit, then there would be enactments of rage, such as late submission of assignments or absenteeism from class and from supervision sessions. So this examination situation for Savita, in which she was required to demonstrate her level of understanding and competence, was problematic because she was afraid that her failure would disappoint not just herself, but also those who she looked up to as teachers. She was also afraid of her own rage, that if she's authentic to her caste experience and her indignation and the injustice of it, it will come off as hostile to the upper caste audience. If she's too critical of the institutional apparatus that feels disadvantageous to her, she will upset those in power and she will be judged adversely. Still more, she found herself hopelessly stuck in a cycle of fervent hope and idealizations that these figures could nurture her and protect her from the dangerous realities of caste, and yet how these realities kept haunting within the space of the university and the kind of disillusionment that brings. It's interesting that Sudhir Kakkar in his work has advocated an enthusiastic idealization of one's guru as fostering psychic openness. Because he feels that a student learns more from a teacher by identification with him than by critical engagement. So there is a celebration of self-sacrifice, especially that we find in the myth of Eklavya, that is upheld as a cultural ideal. Now, if this is indeed the case, that surely sets up a very problematic dynamic between an upper caste teacher and a lower caste student. However, I think Dalits today, as Wendy Doniger also notes, also challenge this ideal of Eklavya and use his image to assert a different trajectory in which there is an assertion of an emphatic refusal and rejection of the guru's demand for the thumb. Furthermore, in this kind of caste cosmology, much like Fanon talks about the lactification fantasy that the black has for becoming white, there is also an unconscious wish for becoming an upper caste Brahmin. Right? And Ambedkar also talks about it when he talks about this infection of imitation in his work. Now, Savita wanted to become a teacher, but this brought up anxieties about entering a profession that is traditionally set aside for upper castes. She would wonder, whose dream am I living? Whose desires am I following? If she's successful in her academic endeavors, she experiences potential guilt about leaving her family and caste group behind. And so we had to work repeatedly to offset this kind of propensity for internal sabotage and to shore up this ambitious self. She went on to complete her post-graduation, complete her MPhil, and is now enrolled in a PhD program. So I'm going to just conclude here by also noting what I learned from her journey, and that what I learned from her journey was also the story of what Gopal Guru calls as enormous moral stamina that is required to work through the emotional dilemmas experienced by those who are oppressed. So learning to embrace oneself in a world that is structured by caste distancing is a slow process of psychological growth and expansion. And I think in many ways, I'll pause now, but in many ways, writing this particular part was also my way of acknowledging and a tribute to the immense, like I said, moral stamina that she displayed. And I think that we as teachers would need in order to continue our work of an emancipatory vision of education. Thank you. And once again, sorry for extending the time much more beyond what we had imagined.
No, please don't say sorry, Deepti. I can continue for 2 more hours. Not a problem. I found actually the last 4 lines that you shared with us very, very important. You did not read it out. Upper caste guilt. Would you be okay reading it out? It may bring a...
Why don't you read it out, Anuda, please?
I will.
Would you do the honors?
Yeah. Upper caste guilt and Dalit shame can collude then in a powerful way, implicating our social and personal histories to produce an undermining of the sense of agency that we want an emancipatory vision of education to promote, actually. So how to birth a kind of a sense of agency that we want an emancipatory vision of education to promote. But what I thought was very, very important, and I'm just holding on to what I said earlier.
Yes.
You are like Sudhir sir, taking forward what Hani has, Professor Oberoi has rightly, I think, beautifully pointed out Sudhir sir as the philosopher of the ant. How to keep the ant together and not fall on one side. So I thought this and was very, very important. Upper caste guilt and Dalit shame, how they can collude, how they can, come together in uncanny ways, operating like a Mobius sometimes, actually, that they come to contribute in a collusion, actually. So this is the first KCPC BMU talk, and Sudhir sir has been foregrounded by Professor Oberoi as the philosopher of the ant. and I thought your hand over here between upper caste guilt and Dalit shame is something we can work on. I don't have time for questions or comments. What I can instead give to us, let's do that. Find an upay again, Deepti. Okay. Let's not end your talk tonight. Okay. I would request some of you who are interested in caste and psychoanalysis to join a small research group of KCPC and BMU. I'm saying this with Professor Nagpal and Professor Menon's permission. And Katha's permission, that we can come together as a small group if you are really passionate about it, ethical passion, let me put it that way, or the passionate ethical, and we come together, take forward this conversation, this work with Deepti. Deepti, if you are okay with it, explore the caste and psychoanalysis question, okay? Because one of the openings that you create in your thesis and in your work, not thesis only, now thesis is a past, you open up what new questions would come up for psychoanalysis if one opens up the caste tag, not race, but caste. Not color, but touch. So you actually do it beautifully in your doctoral work. And that is a question that we need to take up in the Kakkar Center, actually, psychoanalysis and culture. So what new questions come up for psychoanalysis, for the existing idiom of psychoanalysis, conceptual framework of psychoanalysis? What new questions come up when you don't access psychoanalysis through the discourse of race, color, but the discourse of caste and touch and untouchability? So if you can form a small research group out of this, and Deepti, you can continue to talk to us, actually. If you are interested, please send an email. Chinmay, can they send an email to you? It's possible, right? Because
Yes.
everybody has received an email from Chinmay, right? Huh?
Yes.
All those who have registered and those who have not registered. Chinmay, just put your email ID over here quickly.
Can I just say one thing before we end for today?
Yes.
Having left the theoretical part of psychoanalysis for quite some time now, and working with clients in therapy, a question that I was thinking about, Deepti ma'am, was also how do you work with caste in the clinic? Because as the upper caste therapist, you can also collude with the person who belongs to a underprivileged background caste to collude and do more harm unwittingly because intentions aren't enough, clearly. So if we do form that, if we could also talk about it coming in the clinic and how to work with it, because that means what Vanita ma'am was talking about, we would have to work on our superego and on our own defenses. So yeah, just that much.
So we can do it. Actually, another question has also come in the chat that how will you understand caste psychoanalytically? Okay, but the other question is also important. How do you understand psychoanalysis in a caste milieu? So if we can, no answers now, but if we can, with Deepti, open up this space, and whoever wants to join, please write an email to Chinmay, and if we can have a group, we can take this up as a research question. So Deepti's talk doesn't end. We continue with you, Deepti, and maybe you anchor this group. Okay. So thank Deepti, thank all the participants, thank Professor Menon, Arindam, Katha, Professor Nagpal. Amrita, please go ahead. Last words from Amrita. Chal. Please go ahead.
As you said, there's so much more to say. I just wanted to thank Deepthi for such a rich presentation, and that combination of literary as well as the lived experiences that you shared with us has really got us all thinking, and I'm sure we'll have much more to say about this. So thanks so much.
Thanks. I think let's end with Amrita's thanks. Okay?
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah. Thank you, all of you, and looking forward to continuing this project further.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Menon. Bye-bye. Have a good evening.
You too. You too. Have a good day.
Deepthi, I'm not ending the call. I'm letting everybody leave one by one.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm here.
Ending the call is like terminating the session.
So I'm going to also say thanks, Deepthi, and I'm stupid
Oh,
enough to
Rachna's
have
here.
not unmuted myself at that critical moment.
You ask your question now, Rachna. Rachna,
No,
go
no,
ahead.
actually, it's not.